I was in disbelief when I saw my wife and a strange man together at the company couples meeting. My eyes searched for some logical explanation, but nothing made sense. She was there, smiling, wearing that dress I'd complimented before leaving the house, but next to a man I'd never seen in my life. She looked at me, petrified, as I approached. Bluntly, with my heart in my throat, I asked, "Why are you here with another man and not me?" She said nothing. Not a word. Not a gesture. Not a single excuse. She stood there, motionless, her face paling and her eyes wide. And then, without shouting, without causing a scene, I simply left. I left carrying a pain that pierced me like a knife buried to the hilt. I went home, like someone gathering the shards of a life that had just silently exploded. I still considered giving it another chance. I still wanted to believe there was something to save. But in that moment, I understood that not all love can withstand such a profound breach of trust. I decided to move on without her. I packed my things, took leave from work, covered my tracks, and moved to another city. I had to disappear to survive. The betrayal wasn't the end, but the new beginning. And that's exactly what hurts, realizing that, even after years of complicity, even after sharing a bed, plans, tears, and joys, someone you love can choose to erase you like someone turning off a light when leaving a room. Without warning. Without ceremony. The worst thing about betrayal isn't sex with someone else. It's the silence that follows. The gaze that doesn't meet yours. The touch that doesn't seek you out. The presence that no longer feels yours. You know you're being replaced when even the other person's absence becomes more meaningful than their company. And she replaced me before she even walked out the door. When I stopped being a priority, when I became routine, when my words began to be met with monosyllables and my touch with shrugged shoulders. Betrayal is always preceded by disinterest. And now I know this. Now I see everything I didn't want to see while I still believed in us. The craziest thing is that, even after everything, she still had the audacity to come after me. Months later, crossing states, as if it would be enough to reappear with that old, regretful look and the words she never said the day she fell. She knocked on my door, eyes moist, voice trembling, wanting to talk. But it was too late. Time, that ancient surgeon of wounded souls, had cauterized what she destroyed. I was no longer the same man who left. In my new life, I built everything from scratch. I reconnected with parts of myself she never cared to know. I found new meaning, new peace. And more than that, I found someone who saw me as I am, not as a burden or a shadow. The funny thing, if there's anything funny about this at all, is that it was pain that saved me. When it tore me apart, it forced me to be reborn. It forced me to face my own ruins and rebuild something stronger, more true. The pain took me to rock bottom, but down there was silence, and in that silence, I rediscovered my essence. I met new people, was welcomed by unexpected people, and one of these encounters completely changed the course of my life. The most unexpected of hugs came from someone who also carried the scars of betrayal. Two broken hearts that recognized each other, respected each other, and gradually, healed together. I remember the day I walked down a street in my new city and saw a couple laughing together in a cafe. They seemed complicit, honest, light-hearted. And it was at that moment that I asked myself, when did we stop being that? I realized that, as faithful, present, and loving as I had been, I was trying to save alone something that could only be saved together. And perhaps that had always been the mistake. Loving alone is like rowing with only one oar, you go around in circles until you sink. She never understood that. And when she did, it was too late. When she returned, thinking she could still be part of my story, there was already another name in my script. A new page had been written, one where she no longer had a place. And that's the cruelest part for those who betray, discovering that, while you played with the other person's pain, they learned to live without you. There's no revenge more silent than moving on. And that's what I did. Without raising my voice, without exchanging accusations. I simply let her see, with her own eyes, what she lost, and what she'll never get back. Sometimes, when we're in the midst of a storm, everything seems dark. But all it takes is time, some distance, to see that the destruction of something old makes way for the birth of something new. And that's what she didn't understand. What she destroyed freed me. Freed me from emotional dependence, from illusion, from the blindness of habit. I was reborn, and she, well, she stood there, waiting for time to forgive her for something time cannot heal. For a long time, I wondered where I went wrong. I tossed and turned, analyzed conversations, tried to understand. But the truth is, there's not always a just reason. Sometimes, people simply make selfish choices. And no matter how much you've given, how loyal you've been, there are those who will never recognize that. And that's okay. Because the loyalty that matters is the one you maintain with yourself. And I've never betrayed that. Today, when I look back, I don't feel hate. I feel pity. Because I know that what she sought in the arms of another man wasn't pleasure, it was an escape. And now she lives with guilt, while I live with peace. One day, she told me that no one would ever love her the way I did. And maybe she was right. But I also know that, at some point, someone would love me the way I deserved. And that someone arrived. They arrived when I least expected it, when I was no longer looking for it, when all I wanted was to be silent. But true love doesn't shout, it whispers. And it was in that whisper that I reconnected with life. Reuniting with her wasn't the climax I'd imagined. It was merely a belated reflection of what she'd lost. A look, a broken apology, a tearful, "I still love you." But I was no longer the man who'd expected that kind of confession. I was the man who had finally forgiven himself. And that, "No, I'm sorry," can erase. She left once more, her shoulders now hunched with the weight of regret. And I remained, steadfast, my eyes fixed on the new. Because when you go through hell, you discover that heaven is only a matter of perspective. And mine, finally, has changed. But what she never knew, is what really made me turn the page. What she never knew is that the woman who saved me from pain, was someone she knew very well. And the day they met, without knowing they were face to face, changed everything. Because there's one detail I've never revealed. And perhaps, it's precisely that detail, that explains why she lost me forever. Welcome to the channel. Here, we make one thing very clear, we do not support any kind of betrayal. The stories you will hear are fictional, but based on harsh realities, to show how infidelity corrodes homes, tears hearts, and destroys lives. Get ready, because what's coming next is an intense, painful and surprising story. Fasten your seatbelts. You are about to hear a shocking story. The house with its wide windows at the end of the street seemed, to outsiders, a picture of stability and harmony. Neighbors often said it was an exemplary couple. Daniel and Laura were, indeed, the kind of couple who stood out not for their excesses, but for the naturalness with which they shared their lives. They had been together for almost 12 years, and although they had no children, their bond seemed solid, built with patience and dedication. Daniel was a civil engineer, a methodical man, attentive to detail, calm in speech, and discreet in presence. His measured manner contrasted with the expansive spirit of Laura, who worked as an occupational therapist at a local hospital. She was spontaneous, sensitive, and loved to see meaning in the simplest things, in the way the sun streamed through the curtains in the morning, the way the leaves fell in autumn, or the smell of the coffee he brewed every Sunday without fail. They had a well-defined, almost predictable routine, but both seemed to find comfort in that predictability. To outsiders, they were happy. And perhaps they were, to a certain extent. Their marriage was the result of a mature passion. It didn't begin with euphoria, but with caution. They had met at a university conference while they were still finishing their respective degrees. He with his color-coded notebooks and perfectionist notes, she with her backpack full of books on human behavior and contemporary poetry. Their conversations began shyly but quickly deepened. The connection they forged transcended the physical. They enjoyed talking, walking aimlessly together, making excuses to prolong their encounters. By the time they decided to move in together, 5 years after their first kiss, they already knew each other's flaws. She knew he had difficulty expressing emotions. He knew she became easily frustrated when she didn't feel heard. Still, they decided to take a chance on each other. They bought a house in a quiet area, away from the hustle and bustle. They painted the walls, planted trees in the front yard, adopted a stray dog named Tobias, and began building a life that seemed, as far as they knew, sufficient. Routine, however, silently shapes relationships. As the years passed, spontaneous gestures gave way to functional ones. Good morning became a wave, how was your day, became a shared silence at the dinner table. Laura, with her heightened sensitivity, noticed these changes but avoided dramatizing them. She used to think it was just a phase, that every marriage went through colder periods. Daniel, for his part, didn't know how to talk about what he felt. Not because he didn't love her, but because he didn't fully understand his own emptiness. He was a man of action, not words. He felt he fulfilled his role by providing security, sorting out household chores, respecting her boundaries, being present, at least physically. He never missed a moment, never raised his voice, never disappeared without warning. He was always there, somehow, even when he seemed absent in spirit. On weekends, they enjoyed short hikes in the nearby mountains. Laura loved breathing in the fresh air, getting dirty with dirt, and laughing at silly things while taking selfies with her phone. Daniel loved seeing her laugh, even if he couldn't laugh with the same lightheartedness. He was proud of this woman who seemed to carry an entire world within her. When she talked about her patients, the small progress she saw in each one, the dramas she witnessed every day, he simply listened. Sometimes he felt distant from that emotionally charged universe, but he admired her dedication. He believed his role was to embrace her when the world hurt her, even if, over time, she stopped sharing certain pains. Over time, they became part of a couples group at the company where Daniel worked. Monthly meetings, relaxed dinners, discussions about goals, trips, and even group therapy sessions. Laura resisted at first. She found it forced, too artificial. But over time, she became involved. She began to see value in the exchanges, in the stories, in the mirror each couple offered. For Daniel, it was just another corporate formality he accepted without question. He had always been a practical man, willing to adapt to the environment. Even though he found it superficial, he accompanied Laura, participated, and smiled when necessary. Her presence seemed to soften his natural rigidity. And even when something bothered him, he preferred silence to exposure. His way was to contain, to manage. Their home reflected this restrained balance. The kitchen was Laura's favorite space, filled with glass jars, colorful cloths, and plants in clay pots. Daniel's office, meanwhile, was meticulously organized, with his technical books lined up by height and papers labeled by date. They shared the same roof, but they lived in parallel universes. At night, they watched TV shows together, but rarely talked about the episodes. They slept cuddled on cold nights, but didn't exchange lingering kisses. Intimacy was more habit than desire. Even so, there was still affection. There was still consideration. There were still light touches on the arm as they passed, cups of tea left on the bedside table, quick messages in the middle of the afternoon. Laura, restless by nature, sometimes lost herself in overly long reflections. She wanted to understand if she was still where she wanted to be. She loved that man, but she no longer knew if she felt loved the way she needed. Not for lack of gestures, but for the absence of depth. She felt like she was talking to herself in a room with closed doors. Still, she admired his honesty, his steady presence, his unfussy way of caring. She thought perhaps this was the kind of love possible, a peace without surprises. Daniel, however, in his habitual introspection, believed they were fine. He believed Laura's silence was simply fatigue, that the physical distance was the result of her long hospital shifts, of stresses beyond his control. And so, he never delved deeper. He believed time would correct what dialogue could expose. At the company, Daniel had been standing out with important projects. He was promoted to department manager and, as a result, began participating in more events, more meetings, more integration activities. Laura, although proud of her husband's achievements, felt that he was increasingly focused on the outside, on work, on social commitments, on the goals he needed to achieve. And she, who spent her days listening to such rich human stories, sometimes came home wishing only for a sincere look, an unfiltered conversation. She began writing in journals, as she had done in her teens. She wrote about life, about what was missing and what was left over, about the feelings that couldn't find space to be expressed in words. Her inner world was vast, and Daniel didn't always have the key to enter. Between one therapy session and the next, between dinners with colleagues and occasional hikes, their lives continued. Love, though silent, still made itself felt in small gestures. But something, deep down, was changing. And no one seemed to know exactly when it started. Maybe the day Laura cried in the bathroom and didn't tell him. Maybe the day Daniel came home late and didn't bother to let him know. Maybe when they started smiling less in photos, or when the bed started to have plenty of space between them. These are things you don't notice all at once. They seep in like water into a crack, discreet, persistent, and devastating. They remained there, side by side, but the bridge between their hearts was no longer as firm. And, without even knowing it, they walked on it like someone treading on shaky ground, unaware that with each step, they grew further apart. Life, however, has its own way of revealing what's hidden. And sometimes what seems stable crumbles with the slightest push. But he hadn't crumbled yet. Not yet. And on that particular night, at a dinner for the team's couples, everything seemed as usual. Smiles, toasts, small talk about projects, trips, and upcoming meetings. Daniel wore a dark blue shirt, matching the wristwatch she had given him for his last birthday. Laura, in a simple but elegant burgundy dress, seemed oblivious to the celebratory atmosphere. Her eyes wandered. Not out of disinterest, but because of something only she understood. It was as if she were searching for an answer in strange faces, in other people's gestures, in words that were unspoken. And it was there, amidst the fake laughter and the clinking of glasses, that the first crack happened. Not like an explosion, but like the muffled sound of something breaking inside. A barely perceptible noise. But one that, once heard, can never be ignored. That night, when everything seemed to be proceeding normally, something inside Daniel began to weigh differently. It wasn't a sudden suspicion, nor a clear sign. It was more of a vague unease, a poorly explained feeling that spread silently. During dinner with the company couples, he observed Laura's gestures with a care he didn't usually have. He noticed the smiles she gave others, the sparkle in her eyes when someone told a compelling story, the way she held her wine glass with a certain lightness she didn't usually display at home. It wasn't jealousy. It was as if he were watching a scene from the outside, as if he were seeing a version of her he didn't recognize. And this version seemed alive, more relaxed, more interested. When she got up to go to the bathroom and took longer than usual, he wasn't worried, but something inside him sparked, like an echo. Seeing her return, laughing at something she'd heard in the hallway, Daniel's eyes fell on her more sharply. She sat down beside him, gently touched his arm, and asked if everything was okay. He smiled at the corner of his mouth and said yes. Laura noticed the stiffness in his gesture, but chose not to ask. At that point, too many questions created even longer silences. The days that followed seemed normal, but they carried an invisible tension. Daniel would return from work and realize that Laura no longer waited for him as before. It wasn't a lack of affection, but an absence of presence. Sometimes she was home, but seemed far away. She spent more time in the makeshift studio she'd set up on the balcony, where she painted canvases without a clear purpose. Sometimes she'd spend hours in silence, listening to instrumental music or recording audio that she never shared with anyone. When he asked what it was, she'd simply say she was collecting her thoughts. Daniel didn't insist. He never knew how to force doors that were ajar. He preferred to respect spaces, even though it made him feel increasingly left out. One morning, waking up early for an important meeting, Daniel noticed Laura's phone wasn't on the nightstand, where she usually left it. She was still asleep, curled up on her side, her face partially covered by the blanket. On impulse, he got up and, as he left the room, saw the device on the kitchen counter, plugged into the charger. He hesitated. He had never invaded her privacy, nor did he enjoy snooping around. But something about that lack of habit caught his attention. He picked up the phone, casually, just to turn it off. But when he tapped the screen, a notification lit up. It was a message. Just an emoji, a blue heart. Below it, the name of a saved contact with strange initials, something like ML. Nothing suspicious in itself, but enough to put his mind on edge. He didn't unlock it, didn't open anything. He simply turned off the device and returned to the bedroom. Laura was still asleep. He watched her for a few seconds, trying to find in that serene face any sign of deception, guilt, or deception. But her face was the same as always, calm, even beautiful, serene as a lake. And that confused him even more. That night, dinner was silent. Laura talked about the hospital, saying a patient had responded well to a new treatment, that the staff was satisfied. He listened, nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. The messages, the glances, the loose laughter during their meetings. They weren't proof. But they weren't coincidences either. He began to notice small changes in her behavior. The perfume she'd previously worn only on special occasions now appeared on random days. A new lipstick in her purse, more elaborate clothes for work. Subtle but constant details. There were no confrontations. Daniel wasn't one to shout or explode. His silence was more painful than any argument. And Laura seemed to notice. She began to delicately avoid him. Touches became rare, kisses were replaced by quick hugs, their bodies in bed shared the space like two strangers who'd learned to coexist without bumping into each other. As the weeks passed, the couple's group meetings continued, and Daniel secretly grew to loathe them. Not for the people themselves, but for the charade they maintained there. Everyone pretended their relationships were fine, everyone laughed too loudly, drank a little more than necessary, exchanging advice they didn't even apply to their own lives. He watched Laura at these meetings like someone watching a play. She was friendly, relaxed, sometimes charming. And that hurt him. Because she wasn't like that with him anymore. What she offered so naturally to others was now denied to him with an almost cruel subtlety. It was on a Saturday afternoon that the absence took shape. Laura said she was going out to take care of something at the hospital, that there was a patient scheduled for discharge and she needed to sign some paperwork. Daniel thought it was strange. It was Saturday. But he didn't question it. He just nodded and watched her leave. He spent the afternoon at home, watching television mindlessly, fiddling with things that didn't need tidying. When the clock struck almost 7 and she still hadn't returned, he picked up the phone. He called. He called until it went to voicemail. He sent a message. No answer. Instinctively, he opened his laptop and accessed a location app he'd installed months earlier after tracking her own car. The dot on the map didn't indicate the hospital. It indicated a restaurant on the other side of town. For a few seconds, he didn't know what to do. He felt a mixture of anger, anxiety, and disbelief. He put on a random shirt, grabbed his car keys, and drove without much thought. Traffic was flowing. In a little over 20 minutes, he parked in front of the restaurant. It was an upscale place, with low lighting and ambient music. He didn't go in right away. He watched through the large glass windows, trying to spot any movement. And then he saw it. 2 meters from the front door, at a table near the wall, Laura was sitting. Across from her, a man. Not a friend, not a coworker. A man Daniel had never seen before. She was smiling. An open, light, knowing smile. The kind of smile he hadn't seen in a long time. The man touched her hand across the table. She didn't flinch. She just looked down and then looked back at him, with a gleam in her eyes Daniel didn't recognize. At that moment, he felt something inside him snap with a snap. As if something he had been holding onto with all his effort finally gave way under the weight of its own wear and tear. He pushed open the restaurant door without hesitation. His steps were firm, but his breath was shaky. He approached the table, his heart pounding in his temples. Laura saw him before he could say anything. She paled. The man's eyes widened in confusion. Daniel stopped in front of them both, stared at her, and said in a low but sharp voice, a sentence that seemed to have been painfully ripped from the depths of his chest, "Why are you here with another man, and not me?" Silence was immediate. No explanation, no request, no disguise. Laura said nothing. Her gaze froze. The man tried to get up, but Daniel had already turned away. There were no screams, no outcry. Only the pain exposed like an open wound for all to see. That night, he returned home as if walking among ruins. Every object in the house seemed like a mocking memory. The photos, the books, the blanket on the sofa, her scent still on the pillows. Everything now tasted like a farce. He paced back and forth, unsure of what to do. Anger came in waves, but it was sadness that overwhelmed him. He sat on the living room floor, hugging his knees, trying to understand when he lost his place in that story. When she began smiling at someone else with the smile that had once been his. And why hadn't he seen it? Why hadn't she told him? The dawn passed like a sentence. And when the sun began to touch the walls, Daniel knew something had ended. Not just the marriage. But the illusion. He didn't want revenge. He wanted peace. But he still didn't know what lay ahead. What he couldn't yet imagine, was that the man, sitting across from her at that table, held a bond that would change everything. And that the true impact of that betrayal was yet to come. Laura returned home hours later, speechless. She entered slowly, her shoes in her hands, her eyes downcast. She found the living room dark except for the kitchen lamp, where Daniel stood, leaning against the sink, arms crossed, as if waiting not for an explanation, but for a final point. The silence was thick, almost solid. She closed the door gently and remained there, motionless. He said nothing, just stared at her with the eyes of someone who had lost everything and, at the same time, found the truth that hurt more than the lie. Laura tried to walk toward him, but her steps felt heavy, her feet sinking into the floor as if every inch she advanced was a new weight on her conscience. She tried to say something, but her voice faltered. He looked away. He didn't want to hear excuses or empty justifications. What he needed, she no longer had the means to give. The next morning, Daniel packed some clothes into a small suitcase. He didn't make a fuss. He didn't argue. He just walked around the house, taking what was his, without touching what was theirs. She followed him with her eyes, unsure of what to say. When he passed her in the hallway, she reached out, lightly touching his arm, and said they needed to talk. He looked at her for a long moment, as if searching for the last vestige of the woman for whom he had once moved worlds. He said they already knew everything they needed to know. She insisted, her eyes brimming with tears, that things weren't that simple, that he needed to understand. Daniel took a deep breath, fighting the urge to scream, and replied that that was precisely the problem, she had chosen to complicate what was simple. Love is a choice. And she chose to leave. She chose to lie. She chose someone else. The rest was details. He left that afternoon. He left the house with a broken heart but a firm head. He drove for hours, aimlessly, until he reached a coastal town where memories had disappeared. He rented a small apartment overlooking the sea and disconnected from everything. He didn't call friends, didn't respond to messages, didn't want to hear anything new. He spent weeks in silence, listening to the waves crashing against the sand and trying to understand who he was now. The days were simple. He walked in the morning, made his own coffee, read books he'd forgotten. The pain was there, but instead of stifling it, he decided to face it head-on. He wrote letters he never sent, reread the old messages she'd sent him in the early years, and cried. A lot. Not for the end, but for the time he wasted believing in a love that no longer existed. It was during a cloudy afternoon that he met her again. He was leaving a bookstore when he bumped into a woman carrying a bag of books. She apologized, and upon looking at his face, she smiled in surprise. It was Sophia, a childhood friend he hadn't seen in over 15 years. They had gone to high school together and, for a brief period, had experienced something that almost felt like a relationship, but that faded into oblivion. They talked right there on the sidewalk for over an hour. She lived in the area, taught literature, and was part of a reading group for grieving women. The conversation between them was natural, as if time had simply paused. They arranged to meet for coffee, and days later, they were having dinner together, laughing at old jokes and confiding recent pain. Sophia had lost her husband 2 years earlier, suddenly, and still carried the weight of goodbye in her eyes. Daniel found in her not only companionship but also understanding. For the first time in a long time, he felt he could speak without filters. And she listened, attentively and tenderly. Over time, they began seeing each other frequently. There were no promises, no rush. Just presence. And little by little, the silences that once hurt became welcoming. They walked together on the beach, exchanged books, cooked for each other, and built something light, unpretentious, but deeply genuine. Laura knew nothing. She had no idea where he was, or with whom. She sent messages that went unanswered, and when she tried to call, he blocked her. He wanted peace. And it wasn't with her that he would find it. But fate, with its bitter irony, decided to reunite the two. After almost a year without contact, Laura appeared in town. She had discovered his whereabouts through a former coworker who had accidentally mentioned his whereabouts. She arrived unannounced, went to the apartment, and waited for him on the sidewalk. When Daniel arrived and saw her standing there, holding a bouquet of white lilies, he froze for a moment. She smiled nervously, saying she needed to talk to him, that she wasn't there to reopen wounds, but to ask for forgiveness. He kept her gaze steady. He didn't respond immediately. She began to speak, saying she had understood everything too late, that he was the best man she had ever had in her life, that not a single day went by that she didn't regret it, that the other man meant nothing. She said she felt empty, that she had lost herself, and that she just wanted a chance to explain. Daniel listened to her. But her gaze was no longer the same. There was something serene, almost merciful about him, like someone looking at an old story that no longer hurts. Laura simply asked him to listen. That she needed to tell him something he didn't know. Something that would change everything. Without saying a word, he nodded and opened the door to the building. They went upstairs in silence. The apartment was quiet, smelling of fresh coffee and a still warm cup on the table. She sat on the sofa, looking around as if trying to recognize herself in a space she'd never seen before. He sat across from her, arms crossed, waiting. Laura began by saying that, the night at the restaurant, she'd made a mistake. A mistake he couldn't fully explain, but one that had deeper roots than he'd imagined. He said that, months earlier, during one of the couple's meetings, he'd run into someone he already knew. A man who had been part of his youth, with whom she'd had a brief fling before meeting Daniel. What Daniel didn't know, what he never knew, was that this man was Sophia's cousin. His name was Marcos. And Laura didn't know about the connection between him and Sophia until much later. She didn't know that by getting involved with him, she was digging a hole that wouldn't just end in the end of her marriage, but that would affect people she never imagined. She said the relationship was brief, impulsive, fueled by an unresolved need. But it ended as quickly as it began. She didn't love Marcos. She simply felt seen by him, at a time when Daniel seemed blind. But what she discovered later, was what destroyed her inside. Sophia and Marcos had had a terrible fight years before. He was responsible for a family scandal that drove them apart. Sophia never wanted contact again. And when she learned that Laura had been involved with him, even without knowing the connection, she was devastated. It was Sophia who recognized Laura, weeks after she started dating Daniel. She said nothing. She didn't confront him. She kept the secret silently, respecting his choice, respecting his pain. And it was this woman, betrayed in so many ways, who welcomed him without judgment, without demands, without ever revealing what she knew. Daniel felt his stomach sink. The world spun for a few seconds. Laura said she only discovered the connection between Marcos and Sophia when she saw a photo of the two of them in an old family album, weeks after their breakup. She tried to reach out to Sophia to explain, but was ignored. He tried to erase the past, but the damage was already done. And now, seeing Daniel with her, seeing how close they were, she decided to tell him the truth. Not out of ego, but because she thought he deserved to know who, in a suit, was the woman who helped him rebuild himself. And who, in a suit, was the woman who destroyed him. Daniel was silent for a long time. His face was still, his eyes fixed on a random point. Laura wept softly, saying she felt ashamed, that she didn't expect forgiveness, but that she needed to let go of that burden. When she finally spoke, her voice was firm. She said she now understood what true love was. That Sophia, with her silence, her dignity, and her ability to love without demands, had shown him more than any speech. And that Laura, with all her justifications and requests, had become the past he needed to forget. He stood up, opened the door, and said simply that she deserved the chance to rebuild her own life, but that his had already begun without her. Laura stood slowly, her shoulders hunched, her face streaked with tears. She left without another word, carrying with her not only regret, but the certainty that she had lost not only the man who loved her, but also the respect of the woman she never deserved to hurt. And there, in the silence of that apartment, with the echo of a late truth still hanging in the air, Daniel understood that sometimes justice comes at the right time, and with the simplest gesture, the truth. The next morning, Daniel awoke to soft sunlight streaming through the living room's pale curtains. He had slept on the couch, still dressed, his mind immersed in the turmoil of the previous night. He hadn't cried, hadn't screamed, hadn't despaired. He simply lay there, motionless, listening to the sounds of his own silence. He felt strange, as if the revealed truth had disarmed something inside him. It wasn't exactly relief. Nor was it anger. It was a profound clarity, as if a mirror had been held up before him, and everything finally made sense, the voids, the unasked questions, Sophia's silences, the hesitations that now seemed like foreshadowing. The day dawned cold and damp. Daniel went for a walk along the shore. The wind hit his face with a certain aggressiveness, but he didn't care. Each step seemed to follow the movement of his thoughts, which came and went in confusing waves. He found himself between two women, but not like in cheap love triangle stories. What existed there was the weight of disappointment and the value of dignity. Laura had been an essential part of his story, someone who had known all his previous versions. But it was Sophia who presented herself before the broken version and chose to remain without demanding anything. This confronted him deeply. He thought of the nights Sophia would listen to him in silence, of the small gestures she made to make him feel whole, even when he was still broken. And now, faced with the revelation, he understood that that silence wasn't passivity. It was respect. It was love in its rarest and most difficult form, the love that chooses not to seek revenge, that doesn't wield truth as a weapon, that withdraws from the center so the other can breathe. He decided to look for her that very afternoon. He climbed the stairs of the old building where she lived with firm steps, but his heart pounding. He knocked on the door and waited. When she opened it, for a moment their eyes met in a thick silence. Sophia was more serious than usual. There was a subtle tension in her posture, as if she had known the moment would come but still didn't feel ready for it. Daniel asked to come in. She made a brief gesture and stepped aside, leaving room for him to cross the threshold. The apartment was scented with the aroma of incense and tea. It was a space filled with books, paintings with handwritten phrases, and colorful pillows. Everything there seemed charged with meaning. Daniel sat on the sofa, his hands clasped together, as if seeking balance within himself. Sophia stood near the window. He began slowly, saying that Laura had been there, that she had told him everything. The revelation no longer came with shock, but with an almost disconcerting calm. Sophia showed no surprise. She simply nodded, as if she had made peace with her own story long before the others. Daniel continued. He said he now saw things from a different perspective, that her silence had been more eloquent than any confrontation. He said he didn't understand how she managed to remain calm even in the face of such intimate pain, an indirect betrayal that could have caused even more damage. Sophia finally turned to him, her eyes slightly teary, and replied with gentle firmness that it hadn't been easy, that each day was a choice, that loving someone who carries within them the past of our wound is an act of courage. And she chose every day not to let that past speak louder than what she saw in Daniel. Because he wasn't Laura's mistake. He was the man she met there, in front of her. And that was enough. He then stood up, walked over to her, and said he didn't know if he deserved it. Sophia smiled with her eyes and replied that no one deserves or doesn't deserve true love. It simply happens, but what one does with it is a choice. He said she chose love consciously, knowing that sooner or later, the past would surface. And now, it's up to him to choose what to do with it all. Daniel felt his chest tighten. He thought about how small he had felt in the face of everything he'd experienced with Laura, and how valued he felt with every gesture Sophia made. And it was precisely this difference that led him to the certainty that his path was already set, even if there were still bridges to cross. In the following days, Laura tried again to make contact. She left long messages, a few letters, and even tried calling Sophia. There was no response. Daniel, however, no longer felt anger. Only pity. Not in a superior way, but sincere. Pity that she hadn't understood the value of what they had when there was still time. Pity that she had let need speak louder than memory, that she had traded presence for novelty. But that was no longer his problem. He had chosen to move on. From that point on, his relationship with Sophia became more solid, but unhurried. There was no rush to define labels or promises. Just a genuine desire to be together. They shared comfortable silences, spontaneous laughter, and lingering hugs that seemed to heal old wounds. He began attending reading sessions with her, helping with group tasks, and little by little, he rediscovered himself not just as a man, but as a human being. He was no longer the same as before. And that was a good thing. A few months later, late on a rainy afternoon, they walked together to the city's viewpoint. It was a place Sophia liked to visit on cloudy days. She said the gray sky brought more sincerity to the world's colors. There, facing the horizon shrouded by low clouds, Daniel held her hand firmly. He said he had never felt so respected, so understood. That he didn't know what the future held, but that the present was more than enough. Sophia hugged him tightly. And there, without needing grand gestures, they knew something new was beginning. Laura, for her part, returned to her old city. She tried to start over. She moved apartments, changed jobs, and began attending therapy sessions regularly. Little by little, she began to understand the emptiness that had existed within her long before the betrayal. She realized she had projected onto the relationship the responsibility of healing her, of filling gaps that were hers, and hers alone. She cried for nights on end as she realized how much she had hurt someone who had only tried to love her. She no longer sought forgiveness. She sought understanding. And that, at least, she began to find within herself. Time passed. They no longer spoke. But the memory of everything they experienced remained like a scar that doesn't hurt, but teaches. Daniel learned that love isn't enough when care isn't needed. Laura understood that what appears to be affection isn't always presence. And Sophia proved that silence can be the greatest cry of love. That story, marked by difficult choices, didn't end with heroism or tragedy. You ended with learning. With the delicacy of rebuilding. With the certainty that there are loves that teach, others that heal, and some that arrive to show that life, even after so much loss, is still capable of surprising. In the days that followed, a new routine began to emerge in Daniel's life. A profound calm had settled into the subtlest details of daily life, as if every small gesture were now charged with meaning. He woke early, brewed coffee slowly, as if savoring every minute of the morning, and left the windows open to let the air circulate through the house. The silence, which had previously been heavy, was now light, comfortable, almost an ally. It wasn't euphoric happiness, nor sudden enthusiasm. It was peace. And this peace came from the certainty that, after so many falls, he had allowed himself to rise with dignity, without losing his capacity to love, without becoming cynical or hardened. The wound still existed, but now it healed with honesty. It no longer hurt as much. Sophia was a firm and constant presence, but without being intrusive. There was a silent pact of mutual respect between them. They didn't make promises, nor did they demand definitions. They just were. And being, after all, was a lot. They learned to share their days with simplicity, sunset walks, impromptu candlelit dinners, long conversations about books, movies, old memories, and possible dreams. Sometimes they spoke of past pains, but not as someone lamenting, but as someone acknowledging the journey they had traveled. Sophia, with her calm and depth, helped Daniel see not only what he had lost, but all he had gained by freeing himself from a relationship that had long since lost him. Meanwhile, Laura faced a different kind of silence. The silence of absence. For the first time in many years, she found herself truly alone. Without Daniel's embrace, without Marcos's illusion, without the masks she wore at social gatherings. The walls of her new apartment seemed to mirror her every choice, every hesitation, every omission. She spent hours in front of the window, watching the street, as if she could find some answer in the movement of people going about their lives, oblivious to her pain. The regret she felt wasn't just for the betrayal, but for everything she'd stopped being while trying to be everything at once. She realized she no longer knew the woman she'd become. It was as if she'd lost her own identity trying to remain desirable, interesting, necessary. Now, with no one to deceive, she began to face the naked truth: she'd betrayed herself long before she betrayed Daniel. Therapy sessions intensified. For the first time, she spoke about her childhood, about the demands that always made her feel inadequate, about the constant fear of being forgotten. The therapist listened attentively, leading her through a path of difficult but liberating confrontations. Laura cried frequently, but they were different tears, those of someone who was finally allowing her wounds to breathe. Little by little, she began to rebuild her autonomy. She returned to painting, this time not to escape, but to express herself. She set up a small studio and began exhibiting her work at local fairs. She found refuge in art that didn't demand perfection, only truth. And this truth began to become her greatest companion. Daniel, in turn, was faced with a new concern, the possibility of a complete new beginning. Sophia made him feel something different, something that wasn't impulsive passion or emotional comfort. It was a solid construction, made of delicate yet firm bricks. He wondered if he was ready to call it love again, if there was still room within him to give himself completely. A moral dilemma silently gnawed at him: was it fair to open his heart to someone who had always been carrying the pain caused by another? Could he love Sophia fully, knowing that her presence arose from the abyss left by Laura? This doubt gnawed at him not with guilt, but with respect. He didn't want to repeat the mistakes of the past, didn't want to occupy the space out of need, didn't want to confuse gratitude with love. So he retreated for a few days, not out of isolation, but out of a need for inner listening. During this time, he reflected on everything they'd experienced. He remembered Sophia's small actions, the way she observed the world, how she laughed softly when surprised, how she used words with almost poetic precision. He realized that she wasn't just a safe haven. She was someone who, even unintentionally, had become an essential part of his new self. Not because she rescued him, but because she inspired him to rescue himself. And it was in this realization that he understood, loving Sophia wasn't a consequence of the pain Laura caused. It was a conscious choice. A decision born not of absence, but of presence. He then decided to seek her out, look into her eyes, and tell her everything he felt, with the clarity and firmness she deserved. Sophia greeted him with that serene smile she always wore. They were in the garden of a simple cafe, surrounded by plants and books scattered across the tables. He held her hand, and before any words could emerge, his eyes spoke volumes. But he wanted to speak anyway. He said he had finally understood that it wasn't about filling the void left by anyone. That she had become her own universe in his life. That being by her side wasn't a matter of making amends, it was a choice. And that he wanted to build a story with her, a story just theirs, without comparisons, without shadows. Sophia listened in silence. Then she simply hugged him. For a long time. Without needing to say anything. That was where she wanted to be, too. And being there, for her, was more than enough. That same week, Daniel received a letter. It was handwritten, with no return address, and a handwriting he recognized immediately. Laura. He hesitated before opening it. But then he decided to read it. The letter was long, sincere, almost painful. She didn't apologize. She didn't beg for him back. She simply wrote as if she needed to release what still hurt. She said she understood the damage she had caused, but also admitted that only now was she beginning to understand her own flaws. She explained that she had stopped trying to find him again because she realized she no longer had the right to invade a space that was no longer hers. She said she was trying to heal, not to win him back, but to avoid repeating the same mistakes. And she concluded by saying that, wherever he was, she hoped he had found the peace that had taken her so long to understand. Daniel folded the letter carefully and put it in a drawer. He didn't reply. He didn't need to. Life at that point had moved on. There was no more hurt, no guilt, no unfinished business. There was only acceptance. The past, finally, was no longer a prison and became simply the place he had come from. And the present was all that mattered. The moral dilemma ended with dignity. Laura understood that loving someone also means caring for yourself. Daniel understood that starting over isn't betraying ancient history, but honoring it by choosing not to repeat its tragedies. Sophia understood that forgiving isn't forgetting, but freeing oneself. 3 stories that intersected, were hurt and rebuilt. 3 people who learned that love, when true, can be born from chaos, but blossoms in the courage to not give up on oneself. And on the horizon, without grandiose promises, a new life was taking shape with the serene strength of someone who finally understood that deserving love is, above all, knowing how to offer it truthfully. On that late afternoon, when the sky held shades of copper and wine, Daniel and Sophia walked through the crafts fair held every 3rd Sunday of the month in a wide square surrounded by ancient trees. The mood was light, but there was a kind of quiet nostalgia in the air, as if the leaves falling around them carried the last layers of a past that was finally beginning to fade. As they surveyed the stalls, they chatted about trivialities, laughing at almost childish details, but it was clear there was something unsaid between them. Daniel held a small package in his coat pocket, something he had bought hours earlier, alone, and intended to deliver at the right moment. Sophia, though calm on the outside, noticed his more attentive gaze, as if searching for an opening, an opportunity to say something deeper. They walked slowly, taking in the details, their shoulders lightly touching with each step, in a silent, solid intimacy that only time can build. As the square began to empty, the 2 sat on a wooden bench beneath a fig tree. Daniel took the small package from his pocket and handed it to her. It was a necklace with an hourglass-shaped pendant, delicate and antique. Sophia examined it carefully, ran her fingers over the metal, and smiled wordlessly. He explained that he had chosen that gift because, for him, time with her was measured not by haste, but by depth. He said that the object symbolized not the time that had passed, but what was yet to come, and that he was no longer afraid to experience it with her. Sophia placed the necklace around her neck, her eyes moist with emotion, and said she was grateful for everything, including the difficult times each of them had faced before meeting. And then they sat in silence for a long moment, watching the leaves dance in the wind as if watching a chapter of their own life end. Over the following weeks, the two began to build new habits. They began renovating small spaces in Daniel's apartment, decided to create a small vegetable garden on the balcony, and gradually made room for each other in closets, shelves, and, most importantly, in their routines. It wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. Some nights, Daniel would still wake with a start, old memories invading his sleep. Sophia, at those times, wouldn't ask anything. She would simply extend her hand in the darkness, and he would hold it as if holding his own axis. On other days, it was she who retreated into longer silences, overcome by memories of past losses, by insecurities that, no matter how hard she tried to control, still lingered. But in those moments, it was Daniel who made the tea, who lit a scented candle, who said, without needing words, that no matter what came, he would be there. One night, after a simple dinner at home, they sat on the living room floor, surrounded by open books and glasses of wine, and Sophia spoke about an invitation she had received to give a talk at a conference on literature and emotional overcoming. It was important to her, but it also presented a challenge, to expose her pain in an academic setting, in front of strangers, embracing her vulnerability as a source of strength. Daniel listened attentively, holding her hand, and said there was nothing more powerful than transforming wounds into language, pain into connection. That she should go. That she had much to say. And in that moment, she understood that this man, who had once been so hurt by words spoken and unspoken, was now the main encourager of her voice. Meanwhile, in another corner of the city, Laura was reorganizing her own existence. She had started working on a social project that taught art to vulnerable women. There, she encountered stories as intense as her own, and sometimes even more painful. She listened, helped, taught painting techniques, and, without realizing it, healed herself with each stroke, each shared color. Some women asked her, curious, how someone so whole had gotten this far. She smiled, without arrogance, and replied that she was learning to glue her pieces together like a mosaic, without the pretense of returning to her former self, but accepting that she was different now, and perhaps even more beautiful for it. One afternoon, a young woman in the group asked her if she believed in second chances. Laura hesitated for a moment. She looked at the canvas in front of her, where she had begun to paint a face in shadow and light, and said yes. But not necessarily with the same people. She said she believed in new beginnings, but that sometimes they don't involve winning back the other person, but rather rebuilding yourself. And as she said this, she realized those words weren't just for the young woman, but for herself as well. She left with tears in her eyes and a lighter heart than it had been in months. Another weekend, Sophia left for the conference, and Daniel stayed in town, busy preparing for a photo exhibition organized by a friend. He used those days to reorganize the house, review old texts he'd left forgotten in digital folders, and write letters that would never be sent. Letters to himself, to the father he never knew, to the child he was, to the loves he lost. His writing served as an honest mirror, reflecting his concerns, his achievements, his mistakes, and his lessons learned. When Sophia returned, she found him more centered, as if something inside him had settled permanently. The morning after his arrival, they sat at the table for coffee and he told her about everything he had done, about what he had written, about the feelings that had surfaced. She listened in silence, then smiled tenderly and said she liked the man he was becoming. Daniel, moved, held her face in his hands and said that part of this was only possible because she had never tried to save him. She had simply been there, allowing him to save himself. Sophia replied that this was what love was for her, not invading, but accompanying. Time passed, and with it came invitations, decisions, and new possibilities. Daniel received an offer to teach at a local university, combining his knowledge of communication and his emotional experience in overcoming challenges. Sophia, in turn, was invited to publish a collection of texts with other authors. The two celebrated each achievement together, as if understanding that the other's victory is also a refuge for themselves. There was no need to promise eternity. They knew that the love they built there needed no seals or labels. It needed only presence, listening, and genuine surrender. And that, day after day, was what nourished that silent but unbreakable bond. Meanwhile, Laura was finishing the painting she'd begun weeks earlier. Her face was now complete, with closed eyes, as if resting after a long journey. She looked at the canvas and recognized herself there. She smiled, took a deep breath, and decided it was time to move on. No longer trying to reclaim what she'd lost, but to create something new with what she'd learned. She called her therapist and said she wanted to end the series of sessions. The therapist congratulated her on her courage, reminding her that the end of a healing process isn't the absence of pain, but the ability to embrace it without letting it destroy us. That same day, she walked to the edge of the lake she used to visit with Daniel. She sat there, stared at the calm water, and for the first time in a long time, felt a peace that came not from outside, but from within. She cried, yes, but not out of longing. She cried out of gratitude. For everything she had experienced, for what she had lost, and most importantly, for what she had learned to let go. It was the beginning of a new cycle. For everyone. And although the stories no longer intertwined as they had begun, each of them now walked with the calm strength of someone who had learned, the hard way, that life isn't about keeping everything we love, but about knowing what to do when what we love no longer belongs to us. That autumn morning, the trees were already shedding their driest leaves, as if the world understood the beauty that lies in inevitable endings. Daniel woke to soft light streaming through the crack in the curtains, to the sound of instrumental music Sophia had left playing in the living room. The aroma of fresh coffee filled the house like an invitation to the present. He got out of bed, ran his fingers through his disheveled hair, and remained silent for a few seconds, simply absorbing that moment of peace. The house was different, and not just because of the new paintings or the shared objects. It was alive. There were voices, laughter, stories scattered across the furniture, photographs taped to the refrigerator, books sharing shelves, 2 toothbrushes in the bathroom, clothes jumbled on the clothesline. There was life, and it didn't come from perfection or security, but from the courageous risk of trying again, with someone who respected him even when he couldn't look himself in the mirror. That same week, they decided to take an important step. Nothing grand, no ceremony, no rings. They simply decided to officially move in together. Sophia brought her plants, her handwritten notebooks, her pictures in antique frames. Daniel reorganized drawers, painted one of the living room walls moss green, and installed a new lamp in the bedroom. These were small changes, but they carried meaning. They were ready to share not only their space, but their time, their silences, their decisions. And it wasn't about starting from scratch. It was about moving forward with awareness, knowing exactly who they were and what they had experienced. Meanwhile, Laura was preparing a solo exhibition of her paintings. It was the first time she would present works signed only with her name, without intermediaries, without curation. She wanted everything there to be raw, true, imperfect. The canvases brought together faces, gazes, interrupted gestures. There was melancholy, but also rebirth. On the opening day, she wore a simple dress and an amber necklace that had belonged to her grandmother. When the first visitor approached and complimented a painting depicting a woman gazing out to sea with her feet sunk in the sand, Laura simply smiled and said that that woman was her. A version of herself that had finally stopped running from herself. That same night, after the exhibition closed, she walked alone to the cafe where she used to write in old notebooks. She ordered a hibiscus tea, sat by the window, and began observing the faces around her, as if searching for stories in their gazes. An elderly couple exchanged silent confidences at the next table, 2 teenage girls giggled at something on their cell phones, and a man read a book with a concentrated expression. For the first time in years, Laura felt at peace in that solitude. It didn't hurt. It didn't weigh her down. It was hers. She knew there was still much to heal, that some holes would never be completely filled, but she also understood that she had found a new kind of freedom. A freedom that came not from the absence of mistakes, but from the mature acceptance that we can't always fix what we've broken, but we can choose not to break anyone else. One afternoon, weeks later, Daniel received a call from a former colleague at the company where he worked. It was an invitation to a mentoring event for professionals in career transition. He thought for a few seconds and accepted. He felt the time had come to share his story not as someone who suffered, but as someone who survived and rebuilt himself. At the event, he spoke about choices, about dignity, about what it means to lose someone we love not because we stopped loving, but because respect was broken. His speech moved many in attendance, especially when he shared that sometimes true love isn't the kind that lasts a lifetime, but the kind that teaches us to recognize who we are even when everything falls apart. Sophia, in turn, began teaching workshops for women experiencing emotional grief. Her readings, her experiences, and, above all, her generous listening, led many to find in her a source of serenity and strength. In one of her classes, she read an excerpt from a poem that said, "I love you not with my eyes, for they see your appearance, but with my heart, for it feels your essence." After reading, she looked at the student who was crying softly in the last row and said in a firm, sweet voice, "True love doesn't shout, doesn't demand, doesn't manipulate. True love walks alongside, even when the other is still learning to walk." The days went by, and one Sunday, while they were preparing lunch, Sophia mentioned that she dreamed of a trip south, a long road surrounded by sunflower fields. Daniel smiled and said he knew a route like that, and they could go together, without rushing, perhaps on the next holiday. They agreed there, amid the smell of garlic browning in the pan and the knowing smiles exchanged between their eyes, that they would take more trips. Not just road trips, but the kind that involve soul, trust, and commitment. And that silent, light promise sealed a new chapter between them. Laura, on the other hand, decided to accept an invitation to exhibit in another state. It was a challenge. Moving again, starting over. But this time, it wasn't an escape. It was a breakthrough. He traveled by car, listening to old songs and remembering the versions of himself he'd left behind. When he arrived in the new city, he rented a small studio with large windows and white walls. He sat on the floor with an open notebook and wrote a single sentence, "It's not about going back to who we were, it's about respecting who we've become." And there, in that void full of possibilities, began another new beginning. A year later, Sophia and Daniel walked through the same market where they had exchanged gifts and promises. It was the anniversary of the day they decided to build a life together. There was no grand celebration. Just hand-holding, confident glances, and a complicity that required no explanation. They stopped in front of a stall selling handmade notebooks, and Sophia chose one with a brown leather cover. She said she wanted to write a new story. Daniel replied that this new story, in fact, had already been written since the day she chose to stay, even when everything hurt. And there, amid colorful stalls, the sounds of laughter, and the sweet scent of dried flowers, they exchanged a kiss that sealed not a happy ending, but an entire path to be walked with courage and truth. Now, tell me, what did you think of this story? Which of these characters touched you the most? What choice do you think you would have made in their place? Leave a comment below, I want to hear your opinion. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any of the upcoming stories. This story shows us that betrayal is more than a slip-up. It's a deep rift that can destroy homes, break bonds, and erase years of love in seconds. No justification is sufficient when respect is abandoned. And even with forgiveness, the scars remain. The pain caused by betrayal echoes silently, spreads, and often forever transforms the sufferer. So remember, true love requires presence, care, and above all, loyalty. And here on our channel, we make it clear, we do not support any kind of betrayal. These stories are fictional, but they carry hard truths that need to be told. So that you, on the other side, never forget how much love needs to be protected, every day. Until the next story. And remember, some losses come to save us.